A wonderful day, everyone. Previously, we discussed about research designs, wherein we focus on the different quantitative research designs. Moving on to our next lesson, and still under the design and planning phase, we're going to discuss population and sampling. Sampling is part of our everyday life. Halimbawa, kung kayo ay magsha-shopping at naisip niyong bumili ng mga bagong damit, ita-try nyo bang isukat yung lahat ng damit sa store before you purchase an item? Siyempre hindi, di ba? Ganun din sa research. Researchers also make decisions based on data from samples. Experts say that the researcher needs a sample that is appropriate to the research question and the theoretical aims of the study, and that provides an adequate amount of data to fully analyze the topic and answer the research questions. So this discussion is structured into two parts. So after a brief overview, the first part includes my discussion about the sampling types and subtypes, and the second part is about the sample size. So let's start. In connection with our topic, you have to take note that in quantitative research, the goal would be to conduct a random sampling that ensures the sample group would be representative of the entire population, and therefore the results could be generalized to the entire population. On the other hand, for qualitative research, the goal is to provide in-depth understanding and therefore targets a specific group, type of individual, event, or process. So to accomplish this goal, si qualitative research focus will be on criterion-based sampling techniques to reach their target group. So qualitative researchers focus on how the sample or small collection of cases, units, or activities illuminates key features of social life. So needless to say, si qualitative research, they are not concerned with issues of generalizability, but rather with a holistic understanding of the phenomenon. So again, no, quantitative research, goal natin yung sampling. Our goal is to have a random sampling to ensure yung sample group is representative of the entire population. Gusto natin ma-generalize to the population yung ating results of the study or findings of the study. Sa qualitative, ang goal natin is in-depth understanding, and it is not about generalizability of the findings. And then, ang ginagamit nating sampling is criterion-based sampling for qualitative research. So yun yung kaibahan ng dalawa and their goal in terms of their population and samples. So let's define several terms before we continue. So first we have population. So it is a complete set of persons or objectives that possess some common characteristic of interest to the researcher. In other words, it is the entire group of people wherein the researcher wishes to generalize the findings of the study. So it's like the totality or the whole, no, si population. Our example here, nursing students in Malolos City, or another example, all barangays in Hagonoy, Bulacan. While sample naman, this is the subset of the population selected to represent the population. So kung yung population is like the whole or totality, si sample naman is the portion of that whole or the portion of that whole, no? So that is sample. For our example, ng sample would be 300 nursing students from 3 universities in Malolos City. So kung kanina ang sample natin sa population would be nursing students in Malolos City. So as our sample, it could be 300 nursing students from three universities in Malolos City. Or kung another population, example kanina sa population is all barangays in Hagonoy, Bulacan. So for our sample, can be 5 barangays in Hagonoy, Bulacan with COVID-19 facility. So researchers commonly select samples, no, for study rather than entire populations due to constraints in budget, time, and manpower. So yun yung mga kino-consider natin. This reasons why we or reason why we uh, gather only sample, no, from the population. So a good sample should be representative of the population, such that the characteristics of the population, especially those pertinent to the study, are reflected in the sample with a fair amount of accuracy. When a sample is chosen properly, the researcher is able to make claims about the population based on the data from the sample alone. So the method of selection and the sample size will determine how representative a sample of population is. Next, we have, so these are still no terms to remember. Element, it is a single member or individual of a population. So yun yung ibig sabihin natin ng element. Sample frame naman is a listing of all elements of a population. Halimbawa nito, membership list. So ibig sabihin lahat, listahan ng lahat ng members. So that is a sample frame. So the elements and or members of the population are selected here in our sample frame. So dito natin kinukuha sa sample frame yung elements or yung members of the population. Pag sinabi naman nating sampling, it is a word that refers to your method or process of selecting respondents or people to answer questions meant to yield data for a research study. Another definition, sampling is the process of selecting a portion of the population to represent the entire population. So the chosen ones constitute the sample. So that is the term, no? Sampling. That's how we define sampling. Next, there are two groups of population. So the target population and accessible population. So pag sinabing target population, it is composed of the entire group of people or objects to which the researcher wishes to generalize the findings of the study, whilst the accessible population is a portion of the population to which the researcher has reasonable access. For example, in a study about the common difficulties encountered by senior high school students in their first semester of school year 2016-2017, the target population may be all senior high school students in Metro Manila. So that is the target population. Lahat ng senior high school students in Metro Manila. However, the researcher may have access only to the students of a specific school. And these students comprise the accessible population. Kung sino lang yung kayang ma-access ng researcher. So that is the accessible population. So yun yung difference, no? Target versus accessible. Then we have inclusion versus exclusion criteria naman. So establishing inclusion and exclusion criteria for study participants is a standard required practice when designing high-quality research protocols. So the inclusion criteria will explain the different requirements someone must meet in order to participate in your study. So depending on your study's Aims and procedures. This could include a participant's certain age group, gender, specific medical diagnosis, etc. So, kung ano pa man yung details na specific to your study, yun yung pwede nyong maging inclusion criteria. The exclusion criteria naman should list features of a person that, if met, immediately deems that person ineligible to participate in the study. So, the exclusion criteria consists of qualities about a person or the external factors around them that would go against the goal of your study or interfere with it. So, this could include, for example, current medication use, diagnosis of a condition that might interfere with the integrity of data collected. So, yung sample statement na ginagamit dito in general would be something goes like this, no? Subjects who have active medical or psychiatric conditions in which, or conditions which, in the opinion of the researcher or investigative team, would compromise their ability to participate in the study. So, yun yung a general statement that we commonly use to um, indicate our exclusion criteria. So take note that it is your responsibility to determine which criteria are crucial for your participants to meet to meet in order to help the study collect the most significant results. So kayo ang mag-a-identify niyan depending on your study. So another example ng inclusion criteria would be BSN graduating students with no RLE deficiencies, male and female, regular 4 years of study, and grades not lower than 80%. So yun yung mga examples. Other example of inclusion criteria ninyo. So we're done with our overview. We now proceed to the first part of our discussion. Okay, which is about the types of sampling technique or the types of sampling methods. So in the book Nursing Research Principles and Methods by Pollitt and Beck, this is 2004, it lists the different types, or si Pollitt and Beck, they listed the different types and subtypes of sampling. So in this image, we have two major categories or types of sampling methods. You have probability sampling and non-probability. For probability, we have four subtypes. So you have simple random, cluster, systematic, and stratified random sampling. Si non-probability sampling naman, we have four subtypes then. First, you have convenience, judgmental or purposive, snowball, and quota sampling. Ngayon, the enduring understanding to be given emphasis is that the strategy or yung method that you will adopt will be driven by the following. So, ito yung mga magiging considerations mo, no? In choosing the sampling technique or sampling method that is appropriate in your study or with your study. So, first, you have to consider your research questions or the purpose of your research. So, it should be aligned or congruent. Second, the time frame of your study, meaning yung timeline nyo lang the timeline that is given to you to accomplish your research work. And then the third one, the resources available sa inyo being a student. So these are the things that you have to consider in choosing your sampling type. So we proceed first with probability sampling. So probability sampling is also called scientific unbiased or random sampling, and they are mostly used in quantitative research. So it is a type of sampling in which all the members of an entire population have a chance of being selected. So by means of this unbiased sampling, you are able to obtain a sample that is capable of representing the population under study or of showing strong similarities in characteristics with the members of the population. So it is very systematic and scientific process. Ang goal natin for probability sampling is to obtain representative elements of population. So again, under this, we have four subtypes: simple random, stratified, cluster, and systematic sampling. So start na tayo sa una, simple random sampling. So it is a method of choosing samples in which all the members of the population are given an equal chance of being selected. So lahat may chance, no, na maging participant kapag simple random yung iyong gagamitin. So it is unbiased way of selection as samples are drawn by chance. It is the best type of probability sampling according to our reference. And in here, the only basis of including or excluding a member is by chance or opportunity. Advantages. So little knowledge of the population is needed. Most unbiased of probability methods. Kaya siya best type kasi nga unbiased siya of all probability methods or techniques. It is easy to analyze data and to compute errors. Ang disadvantages naman ni simple random include kailangan meron kang complete listing of the population. Dapat alam mo sila lahat, which can be time consuming, and then it is expensive, especially if with large samples. So these are the various ways of obtaining samples through simple random sampling. So it include roulette wheel, fishbowl method, and the use of a table of random numbers. And actually, we also use computers or gadgets now to accomplish the process. So let's talk first the fishbowl method. Okay, so this is a method you can use under simple random sampling. So ito yung mga steps involving fishbowl method. So first, the sampling frame or a list of all the subjects or elements in the population in question should be prepared. So gagawa ka ng sampling frame mo. Second, all the names of the subjects or elements should be written down on strips of paper. So one name per strip of paper. So medyo matrabaho talaga siya kasi lahat ng elements in your population dapat nakalagay doon sa strip of paper. So the strips of paper with the listed names are then placed in a bowl or container. So ilalagay mo, just like in this picture, lahat ng names nila ay ilalagay mo, I mean, in the strips, no? In the strips of paper, lahat ng names nila ilalagay mo inside this bowl. And then samples can be drawn as desired. So for example, you have 1,000 population. So you need to have a 1,000 strips of paper here with the listings of all the names of those elements or lahat ng members of that population. Tapos, kukuha ka lang ng desired sample mo. For example, out of, this is just an example. Mamaya, I'll show you how to compute for the sample size. No? For example, you have 1,000 population and you only need like 250 sample size. So, 250 times kang bubunot. So, that is for the fishbowl method. Next, you have a more systematic procedure for randomly selecting samples is the use of a table of random numbers. So this table is a list of numbers that have been generated in such a manner that there is no order or sequencing of numbers. So this table can be generated by a computer. Pakita ko lang yung sample na ito na yung sample of table of random numbers. So yung numbers dyan in random, no? In any order. So again, for example, total population mo ay like 500 naman. So yung 1 to 500 numbers na yan are randomly arranged, no? Or is randomly arranged in this paper or in this table of random numbers. So these random numbers can have any number of digits and are dependent on the size of your population. So yun na nga kung ilan yung population mo, yun yung magre-reflect na number or numbers in your table of random numbers. So using a table of random numbers, it entails the following steps. So first step, a number should be assigned to each element of the accessible population. Second, the table of random numbers should be entered at an arbitrary or random starting point. So this can be done by closing one's eyes and using a pen to point at a number. So that's how you can start, no, in choosing for your starting point. So close your eyes and then using a pen uh, to point a number or to point at a number. Kung ano yung matapatan mo ng pen in that table, that will be your starting point. Okay? Your first sample. And then a systematic movement should be followed for going up or down, left or right, or diagonally. So from the first na natapatan mo na pen na number, so you can from there you can go up, down, right or left or diagonal para sa iyong mga succeeding numbers na or succeeding samples. So the direction is not important but should be decided before starting the process. So this direction shall continue until the total sample is selected. So tuloy-tuloy lang yung pagpili mo randomly of that number hanggang sa makuha mo na yung total sample desired. No? So continue to select numbers until the desired sample is reached. So for example, ang napili ko ay 6, ito yung naging starting point ko. So I can go down and then so lahat ng numbers like from 63, lahat ng numbers hanggang 24 that's down, makakabilang na as my sample. And then I can go after down, I can go for example right and then up naman and then diagonal. So yun, no? So lahat ng matatapatan ko na numbers, so yung mga associated um, names doon sa numbers na yun, they will be my samples. No? So you just continue the process until you arrive at the desired sample size. So, yun yung ating table of random numbers. So again, ang tinuro ko sa inyo for the simple random sampling includes the fishbowl method and the table of random numbers. So you can choose um, either of the two, no, for the simple random. Next, we have the next type of probability sampling is stratified random sampling. So in this method, the population is first divided into different strata. Pag sinabing strata, this is subgroups or areas or sections. So strata again are subgroups, areas or sections. Like for example, um, I mean, you can divide, no? So for the population, for the stratified random sampling, the population is first divided into different strata. When you say strata, it can be subgroups, areas or sections, and then the sampling will follow. Age, gender, religion, race, and educational qualifications are some possible criteria that you can use to divide a population into strata. So, yun yung mga pwedeng magamit yung criteria so that you can divide your population into strata or subgroups or sections. So, this sampling is usually used to ensure representativeness of the sample size. So, gagamitin mo yung stratified random if you want to ensure na magiging yung lahat ng subgroups or if you have subsections or strata, all of them will have, all of the samples will have representative for each um, subgroups. So that will ensure representativeness of the sample size. Advantages of stratified random sampling: it increases probability of sample being representative and assures adequate number of cases for subgroups. Ang disadvantages naman, it requires accurate knowledge of population. It may be costly to prepare stratified lists and statistics are more complicated. So, yun, yung mga isa sa alang-alang nyo for stratified random. So, as our example, a researcher will study the common effects of smoking on high school students. For example, yun yung kanyang um, gagawing research, no? To study the common effects of smoking on high school students. So using stratified random sampling, the researcher decides to select equal numbers of students from the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior levels. So ibig sabihin, the criteria used is like the year level and the strata include the freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior levels. So yun yung ating strata. Freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior levels. So kukuha ka ngayon ng equal number of students from those strata. For example, 100 sa freshman, 100 sophomore, 100 junior, and then 100 senior. So, yun yung ating stratified random sampling. Pag sinabing stratum, it is nothing but a homogeneous subset of the population. So, meaning they are homogeneous. They are like sharing the same characteristics kapag ka homogeneous. And when all the stratum are taken together, it is known as strata. The third type of probability sampling is cluster sampling or multi-stage sampling, which is used in large-scale studies where the population is geographically spread out. So cluster sampling is defined as a sampling technique in which the population is divided into already existing groupings or clusters, and then a sample of the cluster is selected randomly from the population. So the term cluster refers to a natural but heterogeneous intact grouping of the members of the population. So heterogeneous, kapag ka-cluster, it is heterogeneous and existing kasi yung groupings na yon. So naturally yung pagkaka-group sa kanila, that's why somehow may pagka-heterogeneous yung mga members of that cluster. So it may be difficult and time consuming to use cluster sampling. The most common variables used in the clustering population are the geographical area, buildings, school, among others. So heterogeneity of the cluster is an important feature of an ideal cluster sample design. Okay? So in this slide, I just indicated here differences of stratified versus cluster sampling. So, ito yung meaning, again, stratified. Ito lang kasi sometimes nalilito between stratified tsaka cluster. Sa pag-stratified, this is the one in which the population is divided into homogeneous segments. Meaning halos similar yung ating mga respondents in terms of several characteristics. And then the sample is randomly taken from the segments. While sa cluster sampling naman, the members of the population are selected at random from naturally occurring groups called cluster. So naka-group naturally clustered na, existing na yung grupo kapag ka-cluster sampling. For the sample, stratified sampling, randomly selected individuals are taken from all the strata. So, doon sa bawat stratum, kukuha tayo ng um, elements or individuals randomly. While for cluster sampling naman, lahat na ng members or individuals are taken from the randomly selected cluster. So, ibig sabihin, kung ano yung cluster na mapili natin, at the last clustering level, yun na yung magiging um, sample size or like respondents natin. Okay? And then the selection of population elements for stratified sampling, individual, while for cluster, collectively. No? So, kasi nga, they are arranged into cluster or into group. So, meaning ko ano yung cluster na mapili mo, yun na yung grupo na or yun na yung magiging pinaka-sample or respondents. The objective of stratified sampling is to increase precision and representation, while for cluster sampling to reduce cost and improve efficiency. So this is now an example of our cluster sampling. So a researcher wants to interview 100 teachers across the country. So it will be difficult and expensive on their part to have respondents in 100 different cities or provinces. So cluster sampling is helpful for the researcher who randomly selects the regions. So that's the first cluster, no? Select ka muna ng region and then select selects the school, that is the second cluster, and then the number of teachers. So that's an example of a cluster sampling. The last type of probability sampling is systematic sampling. So systematic sampling is a method of selecting every nth element of a population. Example, every fifth, every eighth, every ninth, or every 11th element until the desired sample size is reached. So ito yung procedure natin. First, you have to obtain a list of the total population represented by capital N or big N. And then, sample size is determined, represented by small n. Tapos, sampling interval width, represented by capital K, is determined by capital N divided by small n, or population divided by the desired sample size. So this is how we compute again for the sampling interval width or K, population divided by the desired sample size. For instance, if the researcher were seeking a sample of 50 from a population of 500, the sampling interval would be, so the width is equal to 500 divided by 50. Kasi population again divided by the sample size. So 500 divided by 50 will give you 10. So ibig sabihin, the width or the sampling interval width is 10. So every 10th element of the population list would be selected for the sample. So that is our um, for the systematic sampling. So every 10th. So after the 10th, um, the next one is yung pang 20 na, and then 30, 40, kung sino yung mga assigned element or respondent doon, sila yung iyong makukuhang ano, magiging part of your sample. Okay? So, if every 10, so that is 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, etc. So, hanggang sa ma-reach mo yung iyong target sample size. Advantages of systematic sampling: easy to draw sample. It is economical and time-saving technique. Disadvantages: samples may be biased if ordering of population is not random. And then after the first element is chosen, the population members no longer have equal chance of being chosen. Moving on to the next major type of sampling is non-probability sampling. So we're done with probability. Next na natin is non-probability. It is a process of selecting respondents in which not all members of the entire population are given a chance of being selected as samples. So dito sa non-probability, hindi lahat ay mabibigyan ng tsansa na maging sample or maging part of the sample. So it is also, there are cases that certain segments of a population are given priority over others, such as when a researcher does not intend to generalize to a larger population. So this is also called as non-scientific sampling and is commonly used in qualitative research. So yung kung kanina, yung probability common, in quantity, itong probability sampling ay non-probability sampling is common in qualitative. No, non-probability qualitative. Pero there are cases na si quantitative research ay gumagamit din ng non-probability. So, nangyayari din yun. So, the subjects are chosen based on their availability or the purpose of the study, and in some cases on the sole discretion of the researcher. So it is more likely to produce a biased sample than our probability sampling. So frequent reasons natin for using non-probability sampling is convenience and desire to use available subject. First type of non-probability is convenience sampling. Pag convenience sampling, it is called accidental or incidental sampling. And as the name implies, convenience sampling involves choosing respondents at the convenience of the researcher, meaning choosing readily available people or objects for study. Ang advantage ni convenience sampling, saves time and money. Disadvantage niya naman, available subjects might be atypical of the population of interest. Example natin, a researcher intends to study the elementary student of a particular school and has determined the desired sample size. Due to the study's constraints, the elementary pupils who are present at that time of the researcher's visit to the school will be chosen as respondents. Ibig sabihin, kung sino lang yung mga available students, elementary students, the time na mag-visit si researcher, sila lang yung kanyang magiging sample. Sila na yung kanyang magiging sample. And that is convenience sampling. Other examples natin, people in the street interviews. The sampling of people to which the researcher has easy access, such as class of students and studies that use people who have volunteered to be questioned as a result of an advertisement or another type of promotion. So yung kanina, people in the street interviews, ibig sabihin kung sino yung mga madaanan mo or makita mong tao sa street, sila na yung iyong magiging sample, magiging part of your sample size or magiging part of your respondents, no? So that is convenience sampling. Kung sino yung mga available, readily accessible or available respondents, they are now your, they will be part of your samples. So that is convenience sampling. The next, we have quota sampling. It involves dividing the population into homogeneous strata and selecting sample elements from each of these strata. So again, i-divide mo muna yung population mo into homogeneous strata. Tapos, you select sample elements from each of these strata. It obtains members through convenience sampling. Pag sinabing quota, it arises from the establishment of a desired quota or proportion to for some population variable of interest. So this is commonly done to ensure the inclusion of a particular segment of the population. So the target population as regards such characteristics. The basis of stratification should be a variable of importance to the study. For example, yung age, gender, educational background. Kasi nga, di ba, i-stratified or gagawa tayo ng strata for this one. Just like in stratified sampling. Gawa ka muna ng strata, tapos you select samples or sample elements from each of these strata. So, yun, that is for the quota sampling. Example, a researcher wants to survey the employees of a company regarding their thoughts on the company's new policies. The researcher intends to have representatives from all departments in his sample, but one department is so small that doing random sampling might result in that department not being represented. The researcher then sets a quota of respondents from that department to ensure their inclusion in the sample. Another example, a survey in which the researcher desires to obtain a certain number of respondents from various income categories. So you resort to quota sampling when you think you know the characteristics of the target population very well. In this case, you tend to choose sample members possessing or indicating the characteristics of the target population. So using a quota or a specific set of persons whom you believe to have the characteristics of the target population involved in the study is your way of showing that the sample you have chosen closely represents the target population as regards such characteristic. Third type of non-probability sampling is purposeful or purposive sampling. So this is also termed as judgmental sampling and the most common sampling strategy, no? Purposive sampling to. So the researcher uses his or her own expert judgment and it involves handpicking subjects, usually to suit very specific intentions. So participants are selected or sought based on pre-selected criteria based on the research question. For example, in a study about honor students, the researcher uses a list of honor students and chooses the necessary number of respondents to the exclusion of all other students. So dito, for purposive sampling, the researcher nag-handpick talaga siya ng respondents that is capable of answering the research question, no? Kung sino yung tingin niya based on his or her expert judgment na makakatulong in answering the research question or attaining the aim of the study. So, yun yung kanyang kukuhaning respondents or part of the sample. So, Newman 2007 says that purposive sampling is appropriate in three situations. So, ito yung mga situations that appropriate si purposive sampling. First, a researcher uses it to select unique cases that are especially informative. For example, a researcher wants to use content analysis to study magazines to find cultural themes. He or she selects a specific popular women's magazine to study because it is trend setting. Second, a researcher may use purposive sampling to select members of a difficult to reach specialized population. And then third, a researcher wants to identify particular types of cases for in-depth investigation. So ito yung mga situations wherein appropriate gamitin yung purposive sampling. Finally, the snowball sampling. So it is also known as chain referral sampling or friendship pyramiding. So the participants refer the researcher to others who may be able to potentially contribute or participate in the study. So this method often helps researchers find and recruit participants that may otherwise be hard to reach. Example natin, contacting fourth-year nursing students who had early pregnancy, then asking them if they knew other students who had early pregnancy. So magre-refer sila kung sino pa yung tingin nila na pwedeng maging respondents na same ng kanilang situation or depending on the predetermined set criteria of the researcher. So sasabihin nila yung criteria or si researcher sasabihin yung criteria doon sa unang na-interview. And then, magre-refer ngayon to kung sino yung possible pang pwedeng maging respondents na pumapasok sa criteria na sinet natin. So, the second major part of our discussion is about the sample size. So, we're done with the first part. Okay, the first major part of the discussion, which is about the sampling type. Okay, so or the different types of sampling techniques or methods. So the second major part of our discussion is the sample size. So sample size is a research term used for defining the number of individuals included in a research study to represent a population. So these are the factors that we have to consider in determining the sample size. First, you have homogeneity of the population. Pag sinabi again homogeneity, it means the uniformity or the similarity of the population. So the higher the degree of homogeneity of the population, the smaller the sample size that can be utilized. Second factor, degree of precision desired by the researcher. So the larger the sample size, the higher the precision or accuracy of the results will be. Finally, types of sampling procedure. Probability sampling uses smaller sample sizes than non-probability sampling. By the way, I'm referring to quantitative research here. No, when we talk about these factors, about sample size, I am referring to quantitative research. So various approaches naman to determine the sample size, and again in quantitative research. So number one, sample sizes as small as 30 are generally adequate to ensure that the sampling distribution of the mean will approximate the normal curve. This according to Schott, 1990. Second, when the total population is equal to or less than 100, this same number may serve as a sample size, and this is called as universal sampling. According to Gay 1976, the following are the acceptable sizes for different types of research. For descriptive research, 10 to 20% may be required. For comparative research, 15 subjects or groups naman. Pero ito ang pinaka ginagamit natin ano, to determine the sample size. Again, si Slovin's formula yung ginagamit natin to compute for sample size. So it is used to calculate an appropriate sample size or number of respondents from a population. So it is also used when you have limited information on the characteristics of the population and that you are using non-probability sampling procedure. So this is the Slovin's formula that we use to calculate for the sample size. So small n is equal to capital N or big N divided by 1 plus capital N times E squared, where small n is our sample size, capital N is our population size, and E is the margin of error. To put it simply, pag sinabing margin of error, it means the degree of uncertainty that your survey results might have. So we allow margin of error because in reality, in statistics, no, we consider margin of error for non-ideal situations. The commonly used margin of error in research is 5%, or in decimal it is 0.05. But remember, you can adjust this number depending on your study. Like you can have it set to like 2% or 0.02. And again, depending on your study. But there's no such thing as 100% or yung margin of error is 0.0, no? So it's either most of the time 0.05 or 0.02. So for the Slovin's formula example natin, ito siya. So let's have an example on how you can compute for the using the Slovin's formula. So we have 7,000 nursing students as our population, and our margin of error is set is 5% or 0.05. Again, ang ating population is 7,000 nursing students. The margin of error set is 5% or in decimal, it is 0.05. So compute for the sample size. So again, we have here the formula. All you have to do is to substitute mo lang or lalagay mo lang yung ating mga data. So population is 7,000, and then what else? 0.05 is our margin of error. So ganun lang, you just indicate here n is equal to, so the big N or the population is 7,000, tapos 1, This is our formula plus, again, another n, capital N, this is the population, and then the margin of error 0.05, a squared mo lang siya. So you compute and you will arrive with this answer. So the sample size is equivalent or is equal to 378.37. May decimal, naka-decimal siya or may point, no? So tinatanggal natin to because in reality, wala namang tawag dito, wala namang naka-point or parang half or fraction na tao. So, round off natin siya, round up kumbaga. So, from 378, round it up to 379. So, this is our um, sample size. So, n is equal to 379. So, another example, we want to do a survey of nurses in the municipality of Pulilan, Bulacan, on how they use computers at work. If a total population is 4,800, and if you want to work with a 95% confidence level, so it means that we are expecting an error of 5%. Or in decimal, it is 0.05. So what will be the sample size? So just the same, the population is 4,800. The margin of error is 0.05. Needless to say, the confidence level is 95%. And then our sample size is yung hinahanap natin. So again, you use the formula. You just substitute all the information or the data that we have. And then after your calculation, you will arrive with a sample size of 369.23. And again, you have to round it off and you will arrive to 370. So our sample size is 370 in total. So we need 370 nurses as our sample size from a total population of 4,800 with 5% margin of error. So that's how we compute for the Slovin's formula. Aside from manual computation, you can also solve for the sample size using online applications and softwares that estimate requirements based on certain criteria sets. So, ito yung, again, isa-set mo yung population nga, confidence interval, or the margin of error. So, ito yung mga pwede natin gamitin na online to compute for our sample size. You have the G-power, and this is the site. EpiInfo, we have here the link or the address, and the ROSOF, and this is the link or the address. So sa institution naman, may iba pa aside from this one or from these examples. So sa institution naman, permits its use. So yan yung mga links or where you can find those online calculators. So that is for quantitative, no? The different considerations for quantitative research. Now, for qualitative, eto naman yung mga i-consider nyo if you are having a qualitative research design. So, three considerations. First, the saturation or redundancy of the sample size must be considered for for qualitative research to. So the size and pattern of the sample need to be has to be considered. Some interviews conducted might result to no significant concepts. Kasi nga baka paulit-ulit na lang yung data na nakukuha natin or we are saturated na with the information. Second, the size of a sample is important to determine the difference within a target population. So having a large sample size might assess the quantity of distinction that will eventually denote the population of interest. And then number three, approximation of a sample size grounded on the method of the study may be used. In every category of a sample size, there are rules of thumb that are represented in the succeeding slides. So, ito siya. So, rule of thumb natin. So, again, ito ay relation to the consideration to the number three, no? To our third consideration. So, again, this is the approximation of a sample size that is based on the rules of thumb that we have. So first you have rule of thumb based approach. So again, rule of thumb based approach. Again, for quality, no? For case study, research approach for case study, rule of thumb natin, you select one case or one person. If the research approach is phenomenology, the rule of thumb is you assess 10 people. If you reach saturation prior to assessing 10 people, you may use fewer. If your approach is grounded theory, ethnography, or action research, the rule of thumb is to assess 20 to 30 people. Medyo mas marami siya, which typically is enough to reach saturation. And this is our source. Rule of thumb naman based on data collection. Ito yung ating mga data collection methods, interviewing key informants. Rule of thumb, you interview approximately 5 people. For in-depth interviews, interview approximately 30 people. And then for focus group discussion, FGD, create groups that average 5 to 10 people each. In addition, consider the number of focus groups you need based on groupings represented in the research question. That is, when studying males and females of 3 different age groupings, plan for 6 focus groups, giving you 1 for each gender and 3 age groups for each gender. And then rule of thumb based in the last data collection pa rin, ethnographic studies, select a large and representative sample with numbers similar to those in quantitative study. Again, if the collection method is ethnographic survey. And again, same source tayo. So that is for quality. So just a note on sample size. Once a sampling method has been determined, the researcher must consider the sample size. In qualitative studies, the sampling typically continues until information, redundancy, or saturation occurs. So madalas nyo itong maririnig. So this is the point at which no new information is emerging in the data. Again, information redundancy or saturation is the point at which no new information is emerging in the data. Therefore, in qualitative studies, it is critical that data collection and analysis are occurring simultaneously so that the researcher will know when the saturation point is reached. It is important to understand that the saturation point may occur prematurely if the researcher has a narrow sampling frame, a skewed analysis of the data, or poor methodology. Because of this, the researcher must carefully create the research question, select an appropriate target group, eliminate his or her own biases, and analyze data continuously and thoroughly throughout the process to bring validity to the data collected. And that is for qualitative research. So yun yung mga i-consider natin in determining the sample size for qualitative research. So we reached the end of our discussion. Thank you for taking time to listen and comprehend sa aking mga diniscuss. And as always, if you have questions, kindly raise them to me during our synchronous meeting. So God bless you and ingat lagi.